Hello and welcome to the first of Cultivating Leadership's global webinar series on Unlocking Leadership Mindtraps with Jennifer Garvey-Berger. If you are listening to the recording, note that the small group discussions are edited out, and please stay tuned till the end. There's a piece of homework to consider before session 2 on May 21st. We hope you'll join us. Without further ado, here's Jennifer.
Here's a poem. It's called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. I love this one. By Portia Nelson, Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down a different street. So I want us to think for a minute about those holes that we fall into again and again, those patterns that we sort of can't help ourselves from repeating even after we know that they are unhelpful for us. And just see if you can connect in you to one of those unhelpful patterns. I know that for me, one of the unhelpful patterns I tend to connect to is trying to make things okay for my kids and seeing whether I can take something that looks a little bit like they're not feeling so happy and try to fix it in some way, as though that's my job or they even want me to do that. And so I'd love you to just touch in to some potentially unhelpful patterns that you find yourself doing again and again. And just notice what that is. And then let's ask ourselves a question. Why do we do that? Like, what keeps us coming back down that same street and falling into the same hole each time? Why do we do that? Why do you do that on that thing? What do you reckon? And again, this is going to be us talking to each other. So I'd love you to either put in the chat or unmute and let me know, what is it that keeps you falling into those traps, that same pattern? Unmute yourself and let me know.
Well, there's this one thing about reliving some kind of problem, like trying to work it out by creating the problem again and again and again and again.
Yeah, it's like you can't resist it. You gotta keep that energy going in your life in some way. Thank you, Dominic. What else?
Hi, this is Sophia.
Hi, Sophia.
For me, I have a very unhelpful pattern of trying to fix everything and make it right, because I like to feel right because that seems safe and no one can say I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I have that one too. What else?
Yeah, hi, this is Henning.
Hi, Henning.
And I think over and over again, I find myself telling myself stories. So spinning myself into a story of something that's definitely not going to happen. But it takes a lot of mental energy that I need to somehow come up from that hole again.
Yeah, the power of the stories we tell each other and those repeated stories that we continue to tell each other. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. So one of the things that's extraordinary about us being able to have this conversation I love Loretta's answer in some way. I kind of like the whole, some of us are talking about being too safe. Some of us are talking about setting the same fires because we enjoy putting them out. You know, like there are all kinds of reasons we fall into these places. And the people who chose to come here are people who are super reflective in the first place. And still, we walk down the same street and fall into these holes. So there's something very compelling about this for us. And I got really interested in this question as I've been teaching about adult development and about leading in complexity for, you know, like the last 15, 20 years. And watching that even when people knew, like really knew the thing to do, they often did a different thing. Like we would have conversations, I would have conversations with the leadership team. We would agree the way they wanted to be with each other. They would agree the things that were most important to them. And then they would start a conversation, and literally like 6 minutes later, they would be doing the things that they had just said they didn't want to do. And that was particularly true, I thought, about some of the ways of being, thinking, and relating that were so kind of funky in complexity. And I thought, and leaders kept asking me, Jennifer, could you just, like, there's so many things to remember. We have this team charter with 8 things on it, and then we have the leadership program and a matrix, and we have these things and those things, and you know, there are 400,000 leadership competencies that I'm supposed to be measured on, and could you just tell me, like, if there are like 3 things, 4 things maybe, like that I could be tracking, could you just tell me what those are? And so I started really playing with, so what is it, particularly in complexity? Because I think that there's a way that the complexity of the world is amping us up and pushing us in particularly unhelpful directions that are very patterned, right? That are very consistent across the leaders I work with around the world, and in me, and in my firm, and in our ways of interacting, and in my parenting. And so I got very interested in what might be a small handful of things that we could recommend for one another, that we could support each other to turn away from the ways our brain and our body is designed to simplify and to protect us from complexity, and instead to face into complexity and use the complexity as a curriculum for our growth and our development. How could we use this not to make us smaller, but use it as a way that we could make ourselves and others around us bigger? And so I have these 5 ideas that I think are actionable. I think they're memorable, and they are totally counterintuitive from what our bodies and brains want us to do when we're facing with a challenge. And so my plan is to share those ideas with you, give you a chance to talk to me about it, give you a chance to talk to each other about it, and let's see if we can get some stories going about these. Does that sound like a good plan today? Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen again. See something to look at. All these slides can be yours. So each of these mind traps comes from, I think, a time in human history when these ideas were super helpful and adaptive. So our bodies and our brains were evolved to help us block out, manage, and as much as possible, turn away from the complexity that we're faced with, because life for so many centuries of our evolution was about simply surviving. And now that we have moved into a world that is so much more complex than the the world we were slowly evolving to be ready for, I think some of these things have turned from helps to traps. So let's start with this one, because it's, in some ways, I think it's the kind of easiest one to see in ourselves. Certainly super easy for me to see in me. We have a kind of default setting where we believe that we're right. Daniel Kahneman, is this Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist. And he sums up all of his work. He says, basically, he doesn't say exactly this, I can get you the quote, but he says, basically, my entire work can be summed up in the idea that most of us think we're right most of the time about most things without giving it very much thought. And that kind of default setting that we are right is incredibly useful if we're in a simple world and we need to be making really quick and simple decisions, and incredibly unuseful if we are on a leadership team where we need to measure things carefully, or in a domestic violence not-for-profit, and we're needing to figure out how to deal with these many conflicting issues, these many conflicting priorities. In those cases, our brains giving us the sense that we are right is particularly unhelpful. And so we get trapped by this, right? And as I was researching this, one of the things that I found just remarkable was the work of Robert Burton, who wrote a great book called On Being Certain. He's a neurologist, and he's really interested in this study of the feeling of certainty, the feeling of knowing, he talks about. And what he found in brain scans is that the sense of certainty, the sense of knowing, is actually an emotion, like anxiety or irritation. It arises in response to a stimulus, but it is not actually a cognitive process. It is an emotional process. And then we backfill reasons onto that emotional process. And so and it happens so fast that we don't notice it. So our experience of ourselves is, oh, we reasoned that through. But those studies that show us that you give two people with opposite beliefs the same article to read, and they come out of it with their previous beliefs strengthened, will show us that we are not particularly amenable to facts or reasoning that changes our belief. I live in London, and so all you have to do is say the word Brexit to understand that people can hear a lot of facts, and it just strengthens whatever they believed in before. And I think we see that again and again on the global and on the local stage. So we confuse the sense that we feel right with actually some like legitimate belief that we are right. When we do that, we shut down. We shut down to data. We shut down to the possibility that we might learn that we're wrong. And in fact, this is this constant battle, is that our brain is trying in many ways to protect us from learning, to protect us from being unsettled. Our brains take up about 30% of our daily calories, and we evolved in a world where calories were hard to come by, and so our brains are just constantly trying to keep us from being unsettled. And that has the side effect of actually creating the conditions for us to treat other people differently. We don't listen to other people the same way if we feel like we're right. We don't engage with them. We don't speak with them the same way. I'm always kind of amazed at the fact that I have clients who pay me to ask them questions and to push at their ideas. And then they go into a meeting, and if somebody asks a question or pushes at their ideas, like, that's a problem. And you get just a very different stance, because with me, they know, oh, we're in this questioning place. But then over here, when somebody asks you a question, it might be challenging your authority in some way. And so we get trapped in that sense that We are right, we need to show that we're right, and we need to convince other people that we're right. So I'd love you to just check in with yourselves about this for just a minute and notice. I don't believe that there's anybody this doesn't happen to, because I believe this is a phenomenon that's just wired into us. I want you to notice what gets in the way for you. Like what do you think, what project or relationship or idea is most blocked by your sense of rightness about something? Just check in with yourself about that for just a moment. I want to ask you to share that, but I just want to think about, like, so how do we get out of this trap? And I think that there are a couple ways. I think that there are like a billion ways, but I was trying to write a really short book. So I'm going to offer you 2 ways, and then you're going to offer me more ways, and then together we're going to grow a whole host of ways, and then we can figure out which ones are going to be most helpful for each of us. The slides will be yours. I'll send them out to you. So I think in each of these, I'm going to offer you a key question, a question that I find particularly helpful in escaping the trap, and also a habit that I think we can develop over time. So, and you see, as you think about your story, you see, I think one of the most helpful questions to get us out of this trap is, what do I believe and how could I be wrong? I love the first half of this question because I feel like the first half of this question, what do I believe, separates out just puts a little bit of daylight between the thing I think is true and the idea that it might be a belief and not a truth. So if I name it as a belief, then I'm checking in with myself. I have just that little bit of distance from it. And how can I be wrong? I think is just an incredibly helpful question for us to be carrying around with us whenever we feel like, oh, I know exactly what the right answer is. How can I be wrong? And then the habit here that I think is incredibly important for us to cultivate is, how do we listen to learn from other people instead of, when we believe we're right, we tend to listen to win. Like, I'll convince you that you're wrong and I'm right. Or we try to listen to fix, like, oh, you would know that I was right if you just understood more, and you had like more of the facts of the situation, or you could see the reasoning. And so we listen to people in those ways. We listen for the holes in their arguments. We listen for the ways we can slip in with some of our own ammunition. And I believe all of that keeps us in this mind trap. And the way out is to listen to them with the idea, wow, this is another human being who believes something really different than what I believe. I bet there's something for me to learn from that. What is that thing for me to learn? Might not be that I change my opinion, but I am open to the possibility that I might be wrong. So there's the first mind trap. We're trapped by our sense of rightness. Joy, are there any questions I should be dealing with in the chat before I move on to the second? And I can't see you if you're making a motion.
I mean, there's great chat going on. Nothing has stood out. If somebody wants to unmute and throw a question in.
I've got a question. It's Trevor again. Jennifer, this might be going slightly off track, but I guess I'm noticing, I guess most of us want to be right, or we can get into that mind trap, but also, particularly, I guess, if people are at work, people expect us to be right as well. So I don't know if those are linked, whether there's a kind of a reinforcing thing, because as soon as somebody kind of says, well, actually, I don't know, or I messed up, what can I learn? People often, that throws other people and maybe sets other mind traps going. I don't know. So I was If I might be taking us off track, but I was curious about that.
I think it's a great inquiry for us to be in. I'm going to hold it for now, but I'd love for us to come back to it. I'm going to kind of zip through the next 4. But I think this question, I think the question you ask, we could ask for each of the mind traps. Like, how much of it is hardwired in us, which I believe it is, but then how much of that hardwiring in us actually makes other people desire it from us? And what do we do with that desiring? I think is an incredibly interesting thing for us to pursue together. So let's not take it here, because I don't think it's particular to here. I think we're actually going to see that question come again and again for each of these mind traps, and let's deal with it after we've seen all 5. Does that work for you?
Perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's look at the second one. Because you'll see, Trevor, that's the same idea lives here, right? We tell simple stories about the world. And those simple stories that we tell about the world have been like incredibly helpful in the world. They've been incredibly helpful for human beings. If you read books like Sapiens, books like that and many others will argue that our capacity for storytelling and our capacity to tell relatively straightforward and easily transmittable and memorable stories are what has created our cultures, our religions, our businesses, our societies, and that those societies have enabled so much of human greatness as we've been working together. And so this idea that we live in the narrative and we tell simple stories is an incredibly powerful and important idea. The problem is that when we tell simple stories about something that's simple, it's great. If we tell simple stories about something that's really complex, we can get really trapped by those simple stories. And here's how I think about it. The narrative form of beginning, middle, and end is really awesome if you're sitting by a campfire and you need to transmit a thing. It's also really helpful if you're a chief executive and you need to get people on board with your mission, right? We're going to start here, we're going to do these things, and here's where we're going to end up. And so that narrative form is incredibly useful and contagious. And in fact, the human brain loves the narrative form so much that even in a very small child, if you offer a narrative form that gives you the beginning, the middle, and then an end that doesn't match the beginning and the middle in some way, the very little child doesn't like that. Like, we are wired for this idea of like a beginning and a middle that rationally follows it in a kind of tight cause and effect way, and then an ending that ties together all those pieces. That's great. And like, I love stories. I was an English teacher. This is some of my favorite things in the world. And it really gets in our way in complexity. So in complexity, there's no such thing as when a thing began. That means there's no middle and there's probably no end. You know, when did weather begin? When did you start your profession? I mean, you could choose an arbitrary time, you could choose a moment, but actually you started your profession kind of always and also sort of never. When will you finish it? Always and never. When did this relationship begin? When did this business begin? All these things have these arbitrary beginnings. When did you start loving your job? When did you start hating your car? As we start to block those in with a narrative form, we start to block out possible information. So I see leaders who say, you know, our customer relations problem began when this event happened, when we did this reorg. But actually, probably the customer relations difficulty is somewhere in the DNA of the company or somewhere in the reward system and goes way back before that time that the person has just mentioned, and will be a thing to deal with long after a particular target has been met. And so resisting that notion of beginning, middle, and end is important for us as we wrestle with complexity. Another thing that they've found reliably and in many ways amusingly is that we project the future. We project the past into the future. We rely on the past to let us know what the future is going to be. And if we are faced with missing data, we just automatically fill in the data, whether it's missing visual data, auditory data, or story-based data. We fill in the blanks for ourselves, and we don't notice that we've done that. So our brain is always struggling to have a story that makes sense. If you don't have enough pieces for the story to make sense, your brain will just make stuff up without telling you. I think that's very interesting. And it does that while it's doing that. We create really simple characters. We create good guys and bad guys. And we tend to be a relatively simple character ourselves in the stories we tell. Generally, when we're telling a story about adversity, we have heroes and villains. And we tend to be on the hero side, and other people tend to be on the villain side. And those things happen very fast. Those assessments happen very fast, and they're very hard to shake, because the first mind trap about rightness, we reinforce our beliefs with the data that we collect. So I'd love you to think for just a minute, for us all to kind of check in with ourselves and just wonder about what's a simple story you're telling yourself right now that's probably more complex than you give it credit for being. Is there a simple story about your kids, or about a client, or one of your direct reports, or a colleague, or a customer? Is there a simple story that you are holding that actually, when you think about it this way, you think, that's probably not the truth. That probably is a simple story I'm telling myself. If there's one you're willing to put in the chat line, feel free to chat about it. Okay, so let's hold that one. Joy, are there any questions, sort of fact questions, that I should answer before we move on to mind trap number 3?
Nope, not at this point.
Okay, sweet. We'll have a chance to all talk to each other after I'm done, but let's just go through them. Oh, let's talk about escaping them. I won't just leave you trapped in it. So I think there are lots of ways to escape our simple stories. One of them is just to have this idea of simple stories. But another one is to, if you're in one of these places where you notice that you're having these very simple characters and you've got villains in your story, one of the most powerful questions I know, and one of the ones I work with my colleagues about, my clients about all the time, and I work with myself about all the time, to be honest, is the question about, how is that other person a hero? How is that person who looks like he was put on the earth to annoy me or get in my way, how is that person actually a hero in his own story and not a villain in mine? How could I really understand and I don't mean, like, sometimes people try to take somebody else's perspective and say, oh, well, that person is being so obnoxious in meetings because probably her mother didn't treat her with enough respect and she didn't get enough attention, and so that's why she's taking up too much space. That's not a hero story. Like, a hero story is not, this person is screwed up for these reasons. That's not what this person tells herself in the morning. A hero story is, oh, I understand this person is probably trying to protect something that's really important, or stand up for a value that's different than my values, but are really genuine and admirable values. Like, what is it that the person tells herself about herself?
Jennifer,
And then
is it only
yeah.
inside their own head, or is it also how are they the hero when I look at how others view them and how effective they are in this situation?
Great question. I think that the perspective shift that is most difficult for me personally is, what does this person say to himself when he looks in the mirror? How does he feel good about himself? You know, there are lots of us who have really strong feelings about the politics of the day, and some of what's happening is inexplicable to us. It's very easy to say, oh, geez, these people are power hungry, or these people are just totally clueless, or whatever. Like, what do they say to themselves about themselves? There's something beautiful to be mined there in our asking that question. And the other thing I think is really powerful for us to do is to carry multiple stories, so that we have a sense that the one story that we're sure is right is just one of many possible stories, and many of them could be right. And the more stories we are carrying, the less attached to any single story we'll be. So when you don't get the call back about the job interview on the Monday when you were supposed to get it, and you figure that means they're talking to somebody else, what's another thing that could mean? What's another way those data could add up to something? And how could you be holding multiple stories, noticing when you're relying on one and holding a different one? Okay, mind trap 3. We love to agree with each other. In fact, when two people who are getting to know each other are out on a first date together, every time they find an area of common interest or agreement, they each get a little hit of dopamine. Just this little moment of pleasure passes through them, like, oh, I see you, you see me, we are the same. And so it genuinely feels good to agree. And in a world where alliances were simple and we needed to be very careful about who was in our tribe and who wasn't in our tribe, that really mattered for us to notice very well, are we together or are we not together? And then for us to go from that place, because the consequences of that were often quite dire. And in complexity, we get really trapped by our inclination to tribe up so quickly and to be in agreement with each other. One of the findings here that I find so extraordinary is the work of Matthew Lieberman, the neuroscientist who wrote a book called Social. And in this book, in his work, he has discovered that social pain, like the pain of being left out of something or not invited to the office party, or the pain of thinking two people are talking about you behind your back, is experienced in exactly the same way that physical pain is experienced in the brain. You can't actually tell the difference in a brain scan between physical pain and social pain, which is why we have in many, many different languages words that connect the emotional with the physical, like heartbreak, because the experience of emotional pain is itself physical. And so he also found, by the way, that if you take an aspirin 20 minutes before experiencing social pain, it will hurt you less. So that is like the weirdest neuroscience finding I think I've ever heard. You can, like, before you go to an awkward cocktail party, you can actually medicate yourself and it will be less awkward. And don't think you should try that at home, but it is a possibility that's very interesting. We also find that the stronger the culture of belonging is, the harder it is to step outside it. So you see this in organizations with really solid cultures about who's us. This is the way we are. These cultures have language for who's us, who's not us. And it's those cultures that people say to me, I love being in this culture, but I'm terrified of being thrown out of it. And so we create these really big barriers to difference and diversity. And in complexity, diversity is not just a nice to have, it's a necessity. without different opinions and different perspectives, we just can't see enough of the system to act. We're just, we're blinded by that. And then the last thing here is when we don't agree, when we can't come to agreement, we polarize. We decide we're not in the same tribe. We're in opposite places. And you see this really interesting work. There's lots of good work, and Joy tells me I have to be faster. So really interesting work done about the ways when we can agree, we begin to amplify more and more of our small differences. So I want you to think right now, what would you say, and to whom might you say it, if you were less afraid, unafraid of being cast out of your tribe? Like, is there something powerful that's lingering in you that you would say if you weren't so caught up by this mind trap? Just rest your mind on that question for a moment. So let's talk about escaping this. I think a lot of what is most helpful for us as we escape this mind trap is about understanding how to do conflict in a new way. How can we disagree with each other in a new way? Can we have conflicts that deepen relationships instead of polarize them or break them? And can we use disagreement to expand our set of possibilities? I think, for example, of the political spectrum and how trapped we are right now by the massive differences between us. And I think about how we can use this actually to create a very wide swath of possible solutions to the things that ail us. Okay. That was the third one. Here's the fourth one. We love to be in control. Our bodies are made happy by being in control. People with a sense of self-efficacy or the control of their own lives, they live longer, they get sick less often. And for all kinds of reasons, we love this feeling of being in control. And it's like all these others, it's a trap in complexity. It's a trap in part because our brain is incredibly good at substituting. And so we substitute those things we can control and measure and change for those things that really matter. We substitute, if we care about customer service, we substitute short wait times at a call center or at a retail center, which we can control and we can measure and we can make happen, and actually makes the complex thing that we're after less likely instead of more likely. We get into all these perverse consequences. We also can tend to believe that somebody ought to be in control about this. It should be me, or it should be you, or it should be somebody. And we can get into a real blame game in complex issues that can't be controlled. We can start to blame, whose fault is it that the economy is doing this? Whose fault is it that the environment is doing that? Whose fault is it that our political realm is doing this other thing? We kind of believe somebody ought to be able to control this thing. And because we believe that, we get locked into a blame game about it. And then the last one is, and I'm still playing with these ideas, but the last one is, I think our need to control actually constrains us so that we only take as those things that are possible, those things that we can control, and it limits our ability to dream. And in complexity, dreaming is one of the most important things that we can do. So trying to create something that's well beyond our sphere of control is, in fact, one of the great things complexity allows and encourages, and yet we tend to create smaller and smaller boxes for ourselves. Joy, are there questions of fact that I should be looking at, or can we talk about escaping these?
I'd go with escaping.
Okay, Joy's looking at the time. And so I think to escape our need for control, we can begin to ask questions about enablement. Instead of asking questions about what can we make happen, we can ask questions about condition creating. What conditions can we create that will enable good things to happen? And I think a big piece of leading in complexity is creating the conditions for good things to happen for people. And thinking about ourselves as leaders as condition creators instead of as people who make things happen. And experimentation is one of the great tools for this and for other things in complexity. And experimentation, even naming something as an experiment, is to show that you don't know how it's going to turn out and that you are in fact not able to control it. So it's this question about how do we have a sense that we are contributing, that we are still together, that we're making a direction more possible, and at the same time understand that we can't put our hands on it or make it happen, because so many things in complexity, anything in complexity we can't actually put our hands on and make happen. I'm going to stop there after these 4, take a few questions because I've been talking a long time, and then look at the 5th one, which is just a little bit different from the others. So thoughts, questions, comments?
I have a comment. So I use applied improvisation in my work.
Say that again, David.
I use applied improvisation.
Mm.
And so one of the things that I keep thinking about through all these mind traps is if it's not true that we don't need to be in control, we don't need to be right, and we have simple stories, all these things that I believe we need small, safe containers to have a visceral experience that's different.
Mm.
And then once we experience that in a small, safe container, then it can globalize more wider, because it's a belief, I think, cognitively, but it's also it's stuck in our bodies.
Oh, for sure, I agree.
And so when we begin to have something new, and I'm doing something with you, Jennifer, and we're collaborating and discovering, oh, I was wrong in where I thought our story was going, but we have joy in it.
Yeah.
I think that becomes a resource then that we can draw upon that says, oh, I was wrong in thinking that I needed to be right, and there's a delight in that. So I just wanted to throw that comment in there.
I love that, David. Thank you. I love the idea of creating these small places for us to practice safely, which I think we can do in improv, in programs, in relationships with each other, you know, in our conversations. And I also love your combining that with play. I think play and laughter is is a kind of a neglected piece of our development. And so much of learning and development happens when we're little through play and laughter, and so much less of it happens when we're grown-ups in that way. Phil, I think you had also unmuted.
Yeah, I'm looking at this through an adult development lens and going, how does this relate? My gut feeling is that either some of these mind traps are specific to different stages of development, or there's a flow to it so that they look a little bit different for each stage of development. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Phil. So the connection, many of you will know that I'm an adult developmentalist, and I love to think about how people grow and change over time. I think that our relationship to these traps changes over time, but I actually don't think that they go away, because I think that there is something like actually, like the mind trap of agreement, for example, you might imagine would be from a time when more of our identity or our ego was embedded in other people, right? That might be strong there. And at the same time, I think it's such a primal drive that our relationship to agreement might change a little bit, but that initial pain actually arises in us across the developmental range. So the kind of conclusion is way too big a word. My current running hypothesis is that our ability to see ourselves in these traps gets faster as we grow. Our ability to grow is seeing ourselves in these traps, so that there's a reinforcing feedback loop there. As we are able to kind of catch ourselves in these things, we can pull into a new relationship with ourselves and with these traps. But actually, Phil, let me use that as a springboard to just, let's talk about the last of the traps, because it's right inside this set of ideas. I couldn't write a book that didn't have, I don't know if you're seeing my Zoom invitation. I don't want to X out of that. So the last of the mind traps is exactly about this question, about how is it that who we are being in the moment is itself both a benefit and a trap. And the way we protect our identities, we are wanting to seem a particular way in the world. Wherever we are developmentally, we're wanting to show up in particular ways for ourselves and for other people, to represent particular values, to be liked by people, to represent particular needs or wishes that we have. And we can get really trapped by our, by the story we have about ourselves and the way that we're telling that story. So one of the interesting findings about this that won't be true of those of us who play in an adult development field, but is true of people who don't, is that most people seem to have an orientation to believe that they have changed a lot in the past, but they won't change very much in the future. Scientists call this the end of history illusion. It's really an interesting thing that seems to be consistent across the lifespan. I think knowing about adult development is an escape to that, but there's a way that we are constantly trying to maintain and protect and defend an identity. My colleague Carolyn writes a lot about this, and Doug Silsby was writing a lot about this before he died. This way we invest energy in putting forward a particular version of ourselves into the world, and that version actually blinds us to some other things about ourselves. And I think that for many of us, our developmental path, Bob Keegan writes about the ways most people don't have a way of orienting across the developmental arc of their lives. They don't have a way of holding on to who I have been, who I am now, and who I may be becoming. And because they don't have that way to understand or map their own changes, then the notion of change is frightening. And so we invest energy in staying the same. And so if you think about this for yourself, you think about, so what is the identity that I am attempting to project into the world, and in what ways does that get in my way? Or the identity that has been true about me in the past that right now is holding me back in some way. You know, I think about for myself, I am and have been a super curious person. I like to be open. And at the same time, those traits in me, which I think are foundational to me, they get in my way as I'm trying to lead a leadership firm, as I'm trying to be a part of a movement, which sometimes requires like decisive action and knowing things. And so I watch the way my own identity structures both enable important things and also hold me back from other important things that I am moving towards. And so to escape from this, I think asking ourselves always this question, who am I becoming? Who would I like to be next? Not the question our society substitutes for this is like, what would I like to do next? Or what would I like to have next? And here I'm talking about, who am I being? And who would I like to be next? And how will I grow into that? How can I have some future version of myself ahead of me, calling me forward into that space? And then I believe, as many of you would know, I believe that having a map of our own development and beginning to hone what I think of as kind of our own developmental GPS, like, where am I being right now developmentally? What can I be looking at myself and asking myself that question? I think that that's an incredibly useful way to be engaged in our own developmental story in a more intentional, thoughtful way, instead of just happening to grow or happening to not grow. So there we go. Let's pause here, stop share. And how about if you get to talk to each other for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and I'll talk together again. But I'd love for you to be able to talk in smaller groups about these questions about, like, in what ways are these traps resonating for you? And particularly, I think it's very interesting to consider which of these, right now in my life, which of these traps is like the trappiest for me, which might have something to do with development, might have a lot to do with context, but whatever it happens to be, I think it's a useful inquiry for us to be in, like, oh, right now the trappiest one for me is this one. And how might I think about decreasing the number of times I fall into that same hole? Which of these ideas or different ideas might I start to play with? So that's your assignment. Joy's about to put you into small groups. You get to connect with each other, because part of our goal is connection. And then you get to consider with each other, which one of these, or two or whatever, is the trappiest for you right now? And how might you think about getting trapped a little bit less often? Welcome back, everybody. So I hope you had, those of you who didn't end up in rooms by yourself and come back and hang with us, I hope you had a good conversation. And I wonder what questions or noticings have arisen for you from that conversation. So we can open it up and talk to each other for a few minutes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So a comment and perhaps a question in what you're sharing, or what we've been talking about, is one, it seems like a lot of these mind traps have some threads of similarity around them. And so I'm curious how you think about that, Jennifer. And also what we talked about in our group is that engaging in some of these practices or habits feel hard, and they require us to relinquish our control. And as much as we might know in our minds that there's value in that, like, how do we get comfortable with that is also an open question.
Two great questions, Nancy, thank you. So the first one about the similarities, yeah, absolutely. I think that in many ways, these mind traps are artificial distinctions, looking at the same set of characteristics, which is basically, we are all acting as if the world is simpler than it is, and simpler, more controllable, and in some ways more dangerous than it is. So they tend to be more fear-based, they tend to be more protective, they tend to be our brain shielding us from things. But I find that separating them out into these distinctions is useful. It helps us remember them, and it helps us find what's the one I want to work on now. And I think we shouldn't take them all on at once, right? Like that curriculum is too big. So I think the places to start are either start where the pain point is the biggest, which is why I've asked you these questions as we've gone along, for us to kind of be looking for, where is it that my making a difference in myself would be most helpful? Because where is it that some of these traps are most getting in my way right now? Just right now, what is that? So I think that that's a useful way to start. And I'm also a big believer in starting where our attention or our energy is drawn to it. So not the one that scares you the most, but the one where you think, oh, that's a cool question. I'd like to ask that question more. Or that's a cool habit. I'd really like to, so that we're going with our spark of attraction. And I think that it's easier to, or something we can play with, you know, something we could experiment with, and that wouldn't feel so dangerous. So I think in many ways, each of these is a developmental move, and they will help our whole system grow. So wherever we start, we've started. Thank you.
Thanks.
Who else has a thought or a question?
I do. Hi, Jennifer. I love these mind traps, and especially the questions on how to free yourself. And in our group, you know, it was clear to me that one of them, the agreement one, has always been the trappiest one for me. And I'm wondering, do we sort of have one that is the most trappy for our whole life? I'm wondering how that plays out, you know, for people.
I wonder that same question. And the more people I talk to, the more I'll know about that. So maybe people could put it in the chat. I'm like right there with you. The agreement one is the trappiest one for me too. And I wonder for others. As I've done my informal polls, or kind of as I've been teaching these ideas, some people are like easily able to identify what theirs is. And it's not always agreement. I have lots of people in my life for whom it's rightness, like that's mine. And there are other people who say, no, they come in seasons for me. So I don't know. It's a cool question. I like to be in the inquiry.
Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
I just came back from a conference of people who are my personality type rather than yours. And I think there were probably 2 people in the 150 who would have said agreement meant anything. We could care less whether you agree with us. And most of us didn't care when we were 2 years old, right? So I'm thinking that some of it's personality, but I also kind of noticed that agreement comes like when you're in the traditionalist mindset, right?
Hi, baby.
Then everybody has to agree on tradition. Hi. And then you move out into the more self-authored, and agreement doesn't mean as much anymore. And so it seems like there's a combination of both innate personality and what stage you happen to be in at the moment that can really get you locked into something or just push it away.
Barbara, I have these same wonderings as you. I wonder how much of it is about personality and we're born with it. I wonder how much of it is about developmental space. And from reading the research, I also really do think that that these impulses might be raised or lowered by things like personality or development, but I also really just think a lot of this is hardwired or is somehow built into our tissues, into our design, because the leaders that I work with just fall into all of these traps so routinely across personality type. So that's my guess, and there are about 1 billion ways I could be wrong. So
I have a comment on that. Which it strikes me, I wonder if we're falling into a mind trap ourselves, because we're kind of trying to work out what is the right answer here, and how can we have control over this, rather than maybe saying, well, actually, it's all so complex, we'll never know why we do it, how we do it, because it's just beyond our, there's so many variables, we'll probably never know. So I'm just kind of curious, as we seem to be working out, how can we know what it is, and how can we have some control over what it is, rather than just saying we don't know, but we can try and work with it.
That's fantastic, Trevor. I love that you pointed that out. I think that these traps are so trappy that it's easy to fall into them even as we're talking about them.
We want a simple story, right?
That's right. That's right. We love a simple story. We love a cause and effect. We love things that we can explain away, and it makes good sense that we have those things, and sometimes they get in the way. How about one more question or comment? Saying that I just wanted one more, like, increased somehow the state.
I'll add one. I'll go back to your poem, Jennifer, at the beginning. There's that sense that when we're in the traps, it is part of our identity. We sort of like being in that trap, and we can relate to that, and it's harder to get out of it and do something different until chapter 4 or 5 of that simple story.
Yeah. It's we become that person. And the question is, how do we continue to stay in the flow of our development? How do we continue to feel okay with the person we're being, and also imagine the person we can be next? Thank you, Michael. So let me talk just very quickly, we're almost out of time, about what I think some practices are that are not trap specific, but that kind of help us build the muscles to get out of any of these traps more often. And then I'm going to offer you some homework, should you choose to accept it. So I think that there are ways that we can be building a ladder that helps us escape from these traps more generally. And as I was thinking about what are the practices that help us from these things, mindfulness is, of course, a really important practice. How are we mindful? How are we watching ourselves? How are we not forgetting that there are choices available to us? But I decided ultimately that it's how can we understand our connection to ourselves and to one another in a different way that is probably one series of helpful ways that we can watch out for these mind traps. So one of them is, I think we need to connect to whatever purpose means to us. I think that one of the reasons to grow is to notice that right now we are not quite grown enough to accomplish our purpose. And purpose can be the keel that keeps us solid in a tumultuous world. So how is it that we can connect to something larger than ourselves and use that as some of the inspiration to notice these mind traps and care enough to get out of them? There's also, how do we connect to the information that's in our bodies? How do we connect to those things that, that we know, but we don't know in a cognitive way? David was talking about the knowing in our tissues. How do we even notice that knowing? So many of us, God knows, I have made a study my whole life of being able to ignore my body as much as possible and use it as the vehicle that carries my head around from place to place. How can we connect and find the wisdom and the knowing that's in our bodies? How can we also actually use our emotions as a barometer, not be used by them, not have them take us out of our ability to be attentive, but actually more and more granular ways and in more watchful, knowing ways? Can we see, what am I really feeling right now? What's the emotion that's really going on for me, and why? And what is there to be learned from that? What is it telling me about my reaction to the world? So many of us have a set of emotions we like happiness and connection, and emotions we don't like rage or sadness or whatever. Well, how do all of those emotions actually help us understand ourselves and our system better? And then how do we use this set of ideas not to bludgeon ourselves with, right? And not to bludgeon each other with, but to use knowing about mind traps, knowing about human development, knowing about the ways we are in some ways not well built for the complex world in which we live. How do we use that to ramp up compassion for ourselves and for other people, to connect more deeply in our fundamental humanity to one another? You know, machines are more and more able to do things machines do well. Humans no longer need to act like machines at work. No longer need to act like machines anywhere. In fact, our charge in this moment in history is to really understand our fundamental humanity and to connect with each other in that fundamental humanity. And so I think compassion is one of these ways for us to be strongly connected to one another, to be able to see the holes we fall into and to be able to get out of them more quickly, and then sometimes to avoid falling into them at all. So if you take all of these ideas that we've been playing with today and you just look for the spark that is for you, here's your charge should you accept it. I am hoping that we'll come together, some number of us will come together in the next 2 weeks, in 2 weeks from now, I think it is. And in that time, I would love for you to have been thinking about a mind trap and a practice, and just begin to play with it, to explore it, to notice it, to watch it, and to jot down notes to yourself about what you're learning. Come in with some story to tell us, to muse with us about, because this is not a set of ideas that is so like impossible to get your head around that you need to study them for 6 more years before you do anything with them, right? Like, these are ideas about us and how we are living. And I think we can put into practice something from these ideas pretty quickly. And the point of the book is for us to be reaching into the next version of who we might ourselves become. And so I would love for when we come back together in this next, oops, I hit stop share instead of advancing the slides. You're going to get the slides, and the next click was just going to take you to information about when the thing is, which is, Joy, tell me, it's 2 weeks from today?
It is the May 21st.
May 21st, at the same time. Same bat time, same bat station. And then we'll just start sharing, what are we doing, what are we learning, and how can we support one another? And I'll tell some stories about what I've been learning since I wrote this book, and people are writing to me about it, and you'll tell some stories about what you've been learning, and we will explore those things together. And then we'll see if we can use all that for a third webinar for us to come together and see now, how do we want to use these ideas with the people who matter to us? Not just us, but others who matter to us. And so that's kind of a plan for the 3. If nobody shows up for the second one, then probably we won't have a third one. So we'll just see whether you're still interested, and we'll explore how can we make these ideas live in the world, because that's the point. And because that's the point, the slides will be yours, the video recording will be yours. Feel free to teach about these ideas. I'd be grateful if you cited me. And if you got people to buy the book, that would be cool too. But the point is not selling stuff. The point is making lives better at a time when people's lives are pretty strained. So that's what we're on about. Does that make sense? Awesome. I've talked very much this session. You guys are going to talk much more next session. Anything else anybody wants to say before we say goodbye to each other for now?
I will say that you'll receive an email with the link to the recording and the slides, and the link that you use tonight, you'll use again for the next two. So.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Wonderful.
Thank you.